Yeoseon stays late at school for what seems like an entirely unremarkable evening, likely finishing up some kind of after-school activity, tutoring session, or club meeting that pushes her dismissal time later than the usual hour. She waits around the school grounds afterward, expecting her stepmother to show up like any other day, glancing repeatedly toward the entrance and checking the time on her phone as the minutes stretch on. There's nothing in her demeanor suggesting she senses anything is wrong. This is simply routine, the kind of small delay that happens in countless families without ever becoming a story worth telling. When the wait drags on longer than she anticipated, with no sign of Kyung-hee arriving and no message explaining the delay, she makes the decision to just start walking home on her own rather than continuing to wait alone in an increasingly empty, quiet schoolyard as darkness starts to settle in around the building. Partway through that walk, a car slows down beside her on a quiet, mostly empty street, and for reasons the film doesn't fully spell out in these early scenes, familiarity, misplaced trust, simple naivety, or just plain bad luck, she gets in without much hesitation. Kyung-hee is expected to pick up Yeoseon that evening as part of their normal routine, though the exact reason for her delay isn't detailed clearly in the sources available to me. Whatever circumstance kept her from arriving on time, work, traffic, a miscommunication, or something else entirely, becomes the single detail she'll spend the rest of the film unable to forgive herself for, replaying it endlessly in her mind. The killer pulls up in his car and takes Yeoseon, his only real on-screen action in this segment, executed with an unsettling calm and casualness that immediately sets the tone for how he'll be portrayed as unerringly ordinary throughout the rest of the story. Kyung-hee spends the agonizing 10 days searching, waiting anxiously by the phone, and unraveling emotionally piece by piece as no real news comes in, likely reaching out repeatedly to police, canvassing neighbors, and questioning anyone who might have seen or heard something that night. Each day without answers wears her down further, stretching her hope thinner and thinner until it becomes almost unbearable to maintain. When the body is finally found, something in her visibly and permanently breaks, marking a turning point after which she's consumed by a crushing guilt that reshapes her entire personality for the remainder of the story, turning her from a grieving stepmother into someone driven almost entirely by self-blame and a desperate need for answers. The killer isn't a particular focus of this segment. The narrative deliberately pulls attention away from him here, centering instead on the emotional aftermath rippling outward through Kyung-hee and the wider community as news of the murder spreads through the building, through the neighborhood, and eventually through local news coverage, setting the stage for the fear that will grip the entire community going forward. The killer is shown going about ordinary building life, greeting neighbors in passing hallways, making small talk in the elevator or lobby, maintaining an unremarkable, almost forgettable presence that blends seamlessly into the rhythm of everyday apartment living, while the audience now holds the deeply uncomfortable knowledge of exactly what he's done just days earlier. This stark contrast between his mundane, ordinary behavior and what we already know about him is clearly meant to unsettle the viewer directly, forcing us to sit with the horror of how easily monstrous acts can hide behind an unremarkable face. Kyung-hee continues grieving through this stretch, likely just beginning to process the horrifying possibility that her stepdaughter's killer could be living somewhere close by, perhaps even in the very same building she calls home, though she isn't yet aware of exactly who that person is or how disturbingly near he actually lives to her own front door. Fook Mo is properly introduced here as the tough, physically imposing loan collector with a gruff, intimidating exterior that nonetheless hides an unexpectedly strong sense of right and wrong underneath it all, and quickly finds himself in a parking dispute with the killer that starts out small and mundane but escalates gradually over several repeated encounters between the two men. He has no idea at this point who he's actually arguing with over something as trivial as a parking space, treating the entire conflict as nothing more than routine neighborhood friction that happens in apartment buildings everywhere. The killer continues maintaining his carefully constructed double life during this stretch, now specifically shown interacting and repeatedly clashing with Fook Mo in a way that will end up drawing far more attention and scrutiny to him than he probably ever intends or anticipates at this early stage. Other residents are introduced as a broader ensemble during this stretch of the film, each given distinct personalities, quirks, backstories, and personal stakes in the building's day-to-day life that will end up mattering considerably later as the plot develops and their individual choices come into sharper focus. The killer begins slipping in small, subtle ways during this segment, keeping odd hours that don't quite match his supposed daily routine, displaying flashes of visible nervous energy in otherwise unguarded moments, and noticeably avoiding certain topics or direct questions whenever they happen to come up in casual conversation with neighbors he encounters around the building. Neighbors collectively start noticing these small inconsistencies piling up quietly in the background of everyday life, exchanging brief glances or offhand comments about his strange behavior in passing, but nobody yet moves from simply noticing something's off to actually acting decisively on what they're observing around them. Kyung-hee is likely among those beginning to pick up on this strange, unsettling behavior, given her deeply personal stake in finding whoever is actually responsible for her stepdaughter's death, though the exact details of her specific observations during this particular window aren't spelled out clearly in the sources currently available to me. Various neighbors, each individually choose silence for their own distinct, self-serving reasons during this stretch of the film. One is preoccupied primarily with protecting the building's overall property value from the fallout of any public scandal. Another is quietly and anxiously counting down the remaining days until his own personal statute of limitations expires on an entirely unrelated crime from his own past, and others simply avoid getting involved altogether in order to sidestep the hassle, awkwardness, and personal risk of acting without solid, undeniable proof already in hand. The killer benefits directly and significantly from this collective, quietly damning inaction spreading through the building. Though he himself isn't shown doing a great deal actively during this particular stretch, the narrative focus shifts almost entirely onto the neighbors themselves and the small, self-serving choices each of them is making in real time, choices that collectively allow him to continue operating undetected. The killer shifts his attention deliberately toward the second young girl who bears an unsettling, almost eerie resemblance to Yeoseon, beginning to watch her closely with an intensity and focus that should be immediately alarming to anyone paying sufficiently close attention to his behavior around her. Kyunghee, her grief sharpens noticeably into genuine urgency during this stretch, once she becomes aware, or the audience becomes aware alongside her, that another girl living in the same building may now be in serious, active, immediate danger, transforming her overall arc from one of passive mourning and self-blame into something far more proactive, desperate, and driven by a need to prevent history from repeating itself. The killer actively works to destroy remaining evidence hidden inside his own apartment during this segment, reportedly including handling a body via suitcase according to some reviews of the film, and experiences several tense, close calls where he nearly gets caught in the act by unsuspecting neighbors simply going about their normal daily routines around the building. Neighbors, some come uncomfortably close to noticing something is seriously wrong during this particular window, whether through routine home inspections, chance hallway encounters, or overheard sounds coming from his apartment, though none of them quite manage to connect all the dots together in time to act. Kyunghee, her personal, grief-driven investigation starts meaningfully overlapping and intersecting with the growing suspicion already quietly building elsewhere throughout the apartment complex, pushing her steadily closer to finally uncovering the truth she's been desperately chasing since the very beginning of the film. Hukmo, his suspicion of the killer, initially rooted in nothing more serious or significant than their ongoing petty parking feud, starts sharpening considerably into something far more serious, focused, and consequential as new details and observations gradually come to light around him. The killer grows increasingly on edge and visibly rattled during this stretch, as these two separate storylines and threads, Kyunghee's grief-fueled personal search and Hukmo's steadily growing suspicion, begin closing in on him simultaneously from two completely different directions at once. The killer accelerates his plan considerably to target the second girl during this stretch, clearly feeling the mounting pressure of suspicion building around him from multiple fronts at once and recognizing with growing desperation that his window of opportunity to act is rapidly closing before he's discovered entirely. Kyunghee and Hukmo are presumably racing against time to act decisively on their respective suspicions before he can succeed in harming the second girl, though the exact individual actions each of them personally takes during this specific stretch of the film aren't spelled out in particularly fine detail in the sources I've been able to review. Neighbors, collectively, likely including Hukmo and Kyunghee, finally move decisively from passive suspicion into direct, active, physical confrontation with the killer, abandoning at last the hesitation, self-interest, and quiet complicity that's defined their collective behavior for most of the film up to this critical point. The killer is effectively cornered during this stretch of the story, his previously calm, controlled, and carefully maintained composure finally breaking down completely as the confrontation unfolds rapidly around him and his careful double life collapses in real time. Kyunghee, Hukmo, and other neighbors work together during this final stretch, however imperfectly, belatedly, and messily, to try to save the second girl before it's too late, drawing on whatever combination of courage, lingering guilt, and sudden urgency has finally pushed each of them into decisive action after weeks of hesitation. The killer faces the direct, unavoidable consequences of the building's residents finally choosing to act together instead of remaining silent and self-interested, bringing the story's central themes of guilt, complicity, and long-delayed justice to their emotional conclusion.